Welcome back. I am very excited now to announce that Yasmine Arsalane will be giving a keynote about some of the major findings from the IEA's flagship report, The World Energy Outlook, which was published on the 27th of October. This year, the report used the latest energy data and market developments to explore key questions about the global energy crisis and how we can overcome it and stay on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yasmine is the lead on economic outlook for power for the report, and today she'll be sharing some of the key insights of the 524-page report. So she'll be sharing a presentation with some of the results, and you'll have the chance to ask questions. So be sure to write down any questions that you have throughout her presentation. Yasmine, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the very kind invitation and the opportunity to share with you the key findings of our flagship report. Okay, so you should be seeing the presentation now. So what I will try to do today is actually in 20 minutes or so summarize the key findings of our flagship publication. So as mentioned, it comes at a very, very pivotal time. Well, we've all seen the global energy system is going through a major turmoil, which can be actually considered to be the first truly global energy crisis. We all see on a day-to-day basis the negative impact of Russia's invasion on Ukraine. We see it on people, we see it on economies, we see it on energy markets. So what we tried to do is in our publication is to look at what kind of response government, businesses, and people can give to this crisis and focusing on two key issues. So one key issue is, first, is this crisis going to slow down or accelerate clean energy transition? And second question is, how can we secure resilient energy system in the future? What kind of energy system we have to build in the future, which would be much more secure, much more resilient? What kind of measures do we need? And basically, the summary to cover what are the hopes in front of us away from this crisis, and as we are also now entering COP27 negotiation, and what are the key challenges ahead of us. So let me start here with giving you something that I would call the heartbeat of the global economy. What you're seeing here is the historic perspective of how good or how not good the global energy economy has been going over the past 50 years. And so the more you go up, like really when you measure your heartbeat, the more countries you see hitting high level of inflation. So the reason of being worried and really these flashing red lights is what the graph tells you. Today, we are approaching 100% of countries hitting very high inflation levels. And we need actually to go back to the 70s, to the previous oil crisis, to see incredibly high level of inflations. Now, governments around the world have already spent and are spending over $500 billion to shield consumers from this increasingly high price, to shield companies, to shield families, to try to avoid this increasing risk of global recession. But one major and one important difference from the period of the 70s is that today, governments around the world have many, many more tools to address this crisis, and in particular, clean energy technologies. So let's have a look at clean energy investment. So if we look at clean energy investment since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, they have been growing, but rather at a slow pace. We've seen a first jump in 2021. Many of this was linked to countries out of the COVID crisis starting to putting in place sustainable recoveries. They started putting money against ambition. And now what's happening over the past several months and over the past year, we are seeing an increasing amount of policy being put in place but not only policies, but the money backing those. But now you can see also what is our expectation is that all this new policy put in place will give a very big push to hit a 2 trillion mark for clean energy investment by 2030. So this is for us quite a lift. It's an increase in expectation already compared to our past year publication, WEO 2021, and it's a 50% boost compared to today. So what are the key policies that are really helping countries to go in this direction? We have the 400 billion US dollar on the table from the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So this is in terms of tax incentives, subsidies, really different support for clean energy technologies, ranging from hydrogen to solar capture, carbon capture and storage, nuclear, etc. We also have in the European Union increasing discussion of meeting and ratcheting up ambition in the Fit for 55 and towards Repower EU. In Japan, we have green transformation and also major new plan in China and many others. So now the question, will this be enough to be on track with the 1.5 degree trajectory? Well, not yet. We would actually need to double that number to hit 4 trillion. And where we see most of the job to be done is in advanced economies, followed by China. There is a lot of work to do to increase the pace of investment in emerging and developing economies. And for us, this is really a critical aspect to be addressed at the coming COP, especially when we see that these are the countries that are the ones suffering the most today from this energy crisis. And we actually estimate that 75 million that had previously access to electricity will now be losing it this year because they are simply not able to pay the bill. And there is one sector in particular that is for us moving ahead and really turning the corner. This is electricity. You have heard, certainly, we have heard and read a lot of news of countries returning back to coal, mainly for energy security reasons and to make sure that the lights are on for the population. And this is happening in Europe. We are also hearing an increasing amount of countries in Asia wanting to build new coal-fired plants. And for us, what is happening is the following. In 2022, as you can see here, it is true, coal had a muted growth in terms of producing electricity, but already solar and wind were larger than the increase in coal. And once you actually put in place the policies, the measures that are already approved. So this is the stated policy world we're talking about, the STEPS world, as we call it in abbreviation. So we can see that this is just temporary. By 2025, coal is going to be on a downward trajectory. And by 2030, we will see an even steeper decline. What is happening is very clear. Clean energy technology and solar in particular are becoming very cheap. Supporting policy like IRA are really even helping to make solar cheaper. And the expectation is that in the next 5 years, solar installed capacity will surpass that of coal to become number one in terms of capacity installed. So this is one of the several historic turning points that we will be witnessing in this coming decade. So by the end of this decade, this means that clean energy, not only solar, we see wind there, but also nuclear, that is helped notably by the restart of many reactors in Japan under the green transformation policies. So when you put all the clean energy technologies together, by the end of this decade, we will be producing more electricity from clean energy than from fossil fuel. This is another major turning point. So what does it mean? Clearly, for emission, this is the good news. We will be seeing a peak in electricity sector emission very, very soon, and then a decline. And this is exactly what we need to keep the temperature stopping from rising. You really see those nosedive in emissions. Now, is this fast enough? Not yet, but it's another acceleration, and it's again led by advanced economies. So if we turn now to outside the power sector, global fossil fuel demands, first with natural gas. 10 years ago, we did a special focus that was called, Are We Entering a Golden Age of Gas? And what you can see plotted here was our demand projection back then, and how actually it happened is very, very close. So 10 years later, we can actually drop the question mark and say, yes, it was a decade of golden age of gas. Now, moving forward, the outlook is very different. This decade, we will see a very modest growth and then a long plateau. Why? This is happening for a variety of reasons. Policies, first, the ones I mentioned earlier, especially in advanced economies, especially in the power sector. We have many more technologies that can produce electricity that are much cheaper than gas. So the key driver of gas demand in the past is drying up. And in fact, for advanced economy, we're going to see even a decline in gas used in the electricity sector. A second key driver, this is another key driver for growth in the past that is drying up, is heating in buildings. We have now a lot of efficiency measures, electricity used for heating, and many more technologies. And this is really putting an end to a growth of natural gas for heating. However, we have those two diverging trends. So as mentioned in advanced economy, a peak and decline, but emerging economy, a continued growth. And so this compensate and leading in this plateau you see in the long term. And alongside that plateau in gas demand, coal demand peaks within the next few years, and oil demand reach a high point in the mid-30s before falling back. And actually, there can be no clearer sign of the change that are currently underway in the energy system than what you have in front of you. What we see here is fossil fuels and the emissions from their combustions. They have risen every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And now all our scenarios have a growing global economy, a growing demand for energy service, but this goes with a reduced role for fossil fuels in meeting those needs. And that's why we are calling this a pivotal moment in energy history. So what does it mean for emission? If we look at where we stand today, we come from this decades of continuous growth in emission, and looking back at our baseline before the Paris Climate Summit, our expectation for global CO2 emission was very clear. We were expecting a very steady increase in CO2 emission, with the world continuing to rely very strongly on fossil fuels, and this would have led to a catastrophic level of long-term warming around 3.5 degrees by the end of the century. Very unsustainable outcome. But as we saw earlier, we are now entering a peak in fossil fuel demand, and that's naturally associated with also a peak in emissions. And so in parallel with this improvement in key technologies and key policies that have already shaved around 1 degree. So we had 3.5 in our pre-Paris baseline. It brings this to 2.5. So obviously this is a better outcome than before, but it's still not enough to really avoid some severe effects of the climate change. Can we reduce it further? Can we shave another 1 degree of that long-term outcome? We have analyzed all pledges that are put on the table today. EU going climate neutral by 2050, India by 2070, China by 2060, etc., etc. If all these countries, they follow through in full and on time with these pledges, and also companies that have promised, for instance, in aviation, for shipping, well, if all this is met in full and in time, and this is a big if, then we can limit long-term rise to 1.7. But there is still a lot more to do to go beyond and close the gap between these announced pledges and the net zero emission by 2050 scenario. Now, energy security is really a key theme in this year, World Energy Outlook, and in particular, the issue of maintaining affordable and reliable supply through transition. So I wanted to illustrate here a few of our points from the Outlook to conclude this presentation. So for the next few decades at least, we will be drawing down a system based on fossil fuel and building one based on clean energy. But the key point I have in mind is that we need both parts, fossil fuel and the soaring clean energy technology, to function well during the duration of that transformation. So really the speed, the security of the transition would depend on synchronizing changes across all these different parts of the energy system. So this brings us to this crucial question of investment. This is where we are today. For $1 spent on fossil fuel, around 1.5 is spent on clean energy transition. And you may recall in one of the first slides that we get to 2 trillion by 2030 in the stated policies. But we would need to go to another 4 trillion by 2030 to get on track for a 1.5 degree scenario. So note that even in such dramatic scenario, the amount spent on fossil fuel is not zero. But that ratio has changed. It's not 1 to 1.9, 1.5 anymore. It's 1 to 9. So we have choices about how we choose to guard against the possibility of future volatility. The preferable way is to follow what we have on the screen right now, meaning a massive scale up in clean energy investment. But if we fall short of that, then to avoid volatile markets, this would require a higher oil and gas investment. And that means that this could risk putting our climate goals in jeopardy. And one thing that is very clear also is that the fastest growth of these investments needs to come in emerging and developing economies. This is where energy demand is growing most rapidly. But clean energy projects face an additional hurdle in those markets. And this hurdle is the high cost of capital. So for example, in a solar plant in key emerging economies, it's been 2 and 3 times higher the cost of borrowing for building those plants than in advanced economies in China. And actually, if we really want to secure transition across all the world, then we need to tackle the risks that would deter investor and financial flow for this kind of project in emerging economies. And actually, COP27 is a key opportunity for advanced economies to show the priority that they also attach to this issue, and in particular in the discussions on climate finance. So finally, we need to be very attentive to new vulnerabilities affecting energy security. We highlight a few issues in the book, but the one I want to focus here is the security of critical minerals and their supply chains. So it could be very problematic to swap one energy security vulnerability for another. Tomorrow it's gas, today it's gas, tomorrow it could be cobalt, it could be rare earth, and many of these minerals is very concentrated. They are much more so than the existing supply of oil and gas or coal. And our demand for those minerals is really going to increase substantially as we move through transition for clean energy technologies that are heavily reliant on those mineral supplies. So for example, in the net zero emission by 2050 scenario, demand for critical mineral increased by a factor 4 already by the end of this decade. So there's a lot of work to be done to scale up this supply chain and make them more diverse. So now to conclude, we've seen the damage done by Russia's invasion of Ukraine to people, to industries, to energy markets. But the government response to today's crisis open up a more hopeful perspective, a real turning point towards a cleaner, a more secure energy system. We really need this massive surge in clean energy investment to keep the door open to a 1.5 degree outcome. Without that, we would need higher oil. We would need higher gas investments to avoid this renewed episode of fossil fuel price volatility. And this could put our climate goal at risk. So here you see also that this journey to a more secure, a more inclusive, a more affordable and sustainable energy system may not be a smooth one, but it's very crystal clear why we need to press ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yasmine. Some really interesting insights in there. I just have a few questions based on the presentation. My first would be, what would be your main takeaway from this year's report in terms of the differences to the previous reports? How are you more hopeful? Are there new challenges? What would you say is the main difference?
I think what is really striking is now energy security is part of the thing that makes the clean energy transition move faster. So we had those climate targets, obviously, but now energy security concerns are a very, very strong catalyst to make things happen much more faster. And I would add another driver that I feel is more and more important in making this ambition translate into reality is what's in the pipelines in our industry manufacturers. So what we've done, partly in the World Energy Outlook, but there is another publication that will be out in January focusing especially on that, is how do we compare the supply chains, what's in the pipeline of solar PV manufacturer for electrolyzer, etc. How do they compare to our net zero emission world? And a reason for hope is that actually in some, and solar PV is a good example, what's in the pipeline for 2030 actually exceeds the 2030 solar PV installed that we would see in the net zero emission. It's not the case for everywhere. And this is plans, it's in the planning stage. Not all of it will actually move forward, but many more can come also. So that's also a key driver, climate ambitions, energy security, plus industrial policies are really together in this pushing the clean energy transition faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is definitely good news. And you talked a lot about how we need to double clean energy investment. That's a really big lever to enabling the energy transition. Do you have any insights on where this investment should come from, or how we can ensure that we get the investment that we need?
Well, a lot of it will go in the power sector. About 60% of this clean energy investment that we calculated is going to the power sector. And maybe one thing to highlight in the power sector is we often think about this huge scale up of solar, of wind, the generation side of things, but it must go in parallel of the infrastructure, so the grids. And this is actually, when we look at the power sector investment, grids is actually the first, the ranks first in terms of where this investment needs to go. It's combining both wind and solar when we look at the numbers. So grids is a very important factor in the power sector.
Mm-hmm. And we just have a question from the audience from Orland. What can local municipal utilities do to strategically plan in light of your findings? Quite a big open-ended question there, but do you have any
it's quite a big question. So yeah. It's really difficult to answer, but I mean, we put a lot of numbers out. We put a lot of findings. I think one of the key question we have is what decision could actually be stranded asset, what could be stranded capital. So I mentioned that we still needed some fossil fuel investment in the 1.5 degree, but these investments are climate-proof investment, meaning that they are thought in a way that they can be transformed in low carbon. For example, pipelines that could be hydrogen ready. So I think that's one of the key findings. If there is still some investment during that transition that can be and needs to be made with the right balance alongside the clean energy transition, but they should be future-proof and climate ready.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Another thing you mentioned is in a lot of the scenarios, it was that the advanced economies really need to take the lead on those sorts of things. Doesn't that go without saying? Are advanced economies doing enough? Do we need to encourage? Are they playing their part?
I think, well, what we saw in the power sector is really there's a huge push from all parts of advanced economies. But first, it needs to go beyond. Most of the policies are focused on the power sector. And of course, it's a good news to have a low carbon power sector, low carbon electricity. It unlocks possibilities for all parts of the energy system. But first, advanced economies could go could push much more in other sectors. And second, I think what is really good with advanced economies moving faster is that then they can, it's not only about the technologies, it's not only about the policy, but it's about the framework to put in place and maybe derive some lessons for other parts of the world of what could work or what doesn't in the transition. So I think it's really important that those who currently have the investment, have the funds, are less affected by the crisis, even if all of us are affected, continue to push forward to have this example in all parts of the energy system.
Okay, thank you so much, Yasmine. That's all we have time for today, unfortunately, but I'm sure everyone really enjoyed those insights. And yeah, what a lot of information for you guys to process. Really interesting to hear. Thank you so much again for taking the time to share them with us today.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the audience as well. Have a very nice end of conference.
Thanks very much. Next up, we will be talking about how we can close the gap between ambition and action. We'll have a 2-minute break and then we'll be right back with you.